Bonsoir. Bonsoir. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to say some introductory words to this afternoon. And this event, this program of lecture was originally conceived by the Italian Culture Institute of Montreal. I'm the director of the Italian Culture Institute, but finally, together with the Desautels faculty of management of McGill University and l'École des sciences de la gestion universitaire de la Université du Québec à Montréal, we conceived this program completely dedicated to a particular subject, the culture of work in Italy. That's the reason because the institute is involved. In Italy, and I think everywhere, the work is the real expression of the human activity. In work you can perceive the philosophy, the rules of social activity as well. And firstly, I wanted to express my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Tony Masi, full professor of the Desautels faculty of management of McGill University, and to Lorenzo Frangi, who is a professor of employment relations at the Université du Québec at Montreal. Two friends and in the same time colleagues, lover of Italian culture. And Professor Masi is a professor of industrial relations and organizational behavior. He received, and I'm personally very proud, the highest distinction of the Italian Republic, Ordine di Merito della Repubblica Italiana, due to his commitment to the Italian scientific and broader community. For more than 15 years, Tony served the McGill University as a provost, improving the worldwide leading reputation of the University of McGill. Lorenzo, who is my friend, is associate professor of, as I said, employment relations at l'École des sciences de la gestion de l'UQAM. In the same time, he is executive officer of the Canadian Industrial Relations Association and adjunct professor of the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. In the same time, I wanted to express my gratitude to our two guests, to Italian speakers, to Professor Chiara Benassi coming from King's College in London, and Professor Michele Faioli of the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. The reason why our institute decided to share this project was simply a consideration. The culture is a real and direct reflection of our country and of generally speaking a nation's culture. And so the work is a field as art, as literature, philosophy, and so on. That's the reason, because the Institute decided the work is firstly a cultural experience, and then all the rest, all we can add and imagine as a so difficult field of human activities. And finally, today's meeting, I think, is a faithful expression of the meaning of sharing and exchanging knowledge. And I want personally to express and to stress at the same time the idea of sharing because is the decisive factor underpinning the knowledge. Knowledge is the noblest product of human endeavor, and such, in this sense, belongs to everyone as a public asset. I would conclude by expressing the best wishes of our institute for the success of this lecture programs. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Francesco, for introducing this topic to the Montreal community about the importance of work as culture in Italy. And as we'll see going forward in this evening's conversation, work is fundamental to the definition of the Italian Republic in the period after the Second World War. And we'll see, it's the first article of the Italian Constitution, where Italy is a democratic republic founded on labor. So we're going to look at some of the ways in which laws have been implemented in Italy that affect the culture of work, and then some of the unintended consequences that Michele Faioli will talk about, and some of the issues related to a group of people who have been normally left out of conversations when trade unions deal with the working class, which are precarious workers in Italy. But, so I guess I'll proceed by talking a little bit first, and then I'll introduce Michele. So, as I said, Italy is a democratic republic founded on labor. That's Article 1 of the Italian Constitution. The fourth article says, Italy recognizes the right of all citizens to work and promotes those conditions which render this right effective. These are very powerful words to have in the first four articles of a constitution of a democratic nation. It puts labor, work, at the center of the discourse about what it means to be an Italian citizen in this republic. So it's fundamental, and we want to establish that fundamental right of citizens to work, and that it's the obligation of the state to promote conditions which makes this right effective. These are, again, very, very powerful concepts. It goes on. It doesn't stop there. After a series of other rights, fundamental rights that are recognized in most democratic constitutions, the 35th article says the republic protects work in all its forms and practices. And this is where we'll hear tonight that there are some unintended consequences for the ways in which laws in Italy have been implemented, and for people who have precarious employment, who have been left out of many of the conversations about work. In addition, most people don't know this, Italy doesn't have a minimum wage law, but it claims in the Constitution that workers have a right to a remuneration that's commensurate to the quantity and quality of their work, and to ensure them and their families a free and dignified existence. So this is, again, a fundamental right written into the Constitution of the country, that you not only have a country founded on labor, you not only protect the rights of citizens to work, you ensure that right, you protect work in all its forms, you give them an appropriate wage, and you make sure that that wage allows for dignity in the way in which citizens live. It also has built in 1948 protections for equal employment. So working women are entitled to equal rights, and for comparable jobs, equal pay as men. And every citizen who is unable to work is entitled to some form of welfare. So these are discussions which now, as we progress 70 years since the founding of the Republic, are very actual even today. Parties in Italy are discussing citizenship wages. Parties in Italy are still discussing equality of pay for men and women. what are the protections for people who lose their job? Do we protect labor in all of its forms? So these are the again, fundamental issues. But it goes even farther. It recognizes in the Constitution that trade unions can be freely established. So it's not just a law. We know in North America, our laws about trade unions owe their existence to a series of battles that were fought at the turn of the last century, end of the 1800s, and into the 1930s and the establishment of the Wagner Act, which recognized the rights of trade unions as a fundamental right that would level the playing field and give workers an opportunity to express their desires for equal pay, better working conditions, and that employers could not discriminate against workers simply because they wanted to join a trade union. These rights are fundamental in the United States for 80 years and in Canada for 70 years. And they are the fundamental principles. But Italy didn't put it in a law. It put this in the Constitution, that trade unions have a right to exist. And it put into the Constitution the right to strike, as long as it's in compliance with existing laws. So this sets the notion, as Francesco pointed out in his introduction, it is part of the culture. Work in Italy is fundamental to the culture as established by a half a dozen or more of the founding principles of the Republic. But there's another part. The 41st article says, Italy believes in private economic enterprise. So it's a capitalist society. It's not a socialist society. It's not a communist society. It's a society in which private economic enterprise is free. But there are limits. It's not supposed to be carried out against the common good or in such a manner that could damage safety, liberty, and human dignity. So these are the fundamental law of the country. The Constitution establishes firmly the principles on which Italy is founded as a republic and the kinds of laws that should follow from these articles, from the principles in the first set of articles in the Constitution, and then from an implementation in articles that execute those things. Now, 22 years after the Constitution was established and became the fundamental law of the land in Italy, the most important piece of labor legislation that it had up until that date was passed. And this was Law 300 in 1970. It's called Lo Statuto dei Lavoratori, or the Workers' Statute. And in it, it establishes the institutional framework for two components of Italy's industrial relations system. It first says, remember, the Constitution says Italy can have trade unions. Trade unions can be freely established. Well, how do you do that? It took 22 years, from 1948 to 1970, to get a law that actually laid out clearly and relatively unambiguously that collective bargaining and representation were, in fact, legal in Italy, and that it was illegal to engage in anti-union behavior, that you couldn't discriminate against an individual or individuals who wanted to form a trade union. So this becomes a law almost a quarter of a century after the Constitution already said that trade unions had a right to exist. It also means that it gave even more explicit opportunities for workers to form unions in Italy by giving them the right to organize union meetings during the working hours. So that now, if the union was going to get started, it actually has a right under the workers' statute to meet on company property during regular working hours to establish the principles that may attract individuals to affiliate with the union. It also creates the notion that there should be workers' democracy, that there should be works councils, what are sometimes referred to, and which Michele will talk about in his portion. There are representative associations of unions that can exist and represent workers, and it takes two different forms that now coexist, something called an RSA, which was established in the Law 300 of 1970, and then an addendum to direct elections that bypasses, if necessary, could have bypassed union representation and have workers vote directly for workers' councils. And it also establishes in the same law, Law 300, not only these rights for collective bargaining, it also gives individuals individual employment security. One of the most contested areas in recent Italian politics, of which Lorenzo has written extensively, deals with this notion that once you have a job, you have it more or less for life, unless you commit a crime or do something that is manifestly deleterious to the workplace and your colleagues. So there's an individual contract. It's really important that we understand that. It's not just about the collective, it's also about individual rights. And it virtually, Article 18 of the Workers' Statute made it virtually impossible to fire a worker except for cause. And it allowed individual grievances to go directly to the courts, meaning that there was no union monopoly on that representation. And an employer who undertook to release an employee from his or her employment, if they weren't sure that they were going to win in court, they had no way of calculating what the cost of that would be in case they lost, and the worker would in any case potentially have to be reinstated. So it created what came to be a sense of real rigidity in the workforce. If you had both collective agreements, which made it possible for unions to organize and to bring this forward, and individual rights, you had both of these parameters in Law 300 that created some really strong general principles. There weren't as many procedures and timelines in Law 300 as some people have later come to think they had. They become entrenched because culture, and I think Francesca pointed this out, culture is a living thing, and practices become as important as what is written. Although we turn to the written word in the law, we have to remember the practices really matter. And so we begin to see that Articles 39 and 40 are made in the Constitution, and Law 300 gives them life. It breathes life into them. Now, of course, if you know anything about Italian history, you know that in the 2 years prior to the Workers' Statute was the single largest strike wave in the history probably of Western Europe. So it's not just that laws make culture, sometimes the laws follow the culture and respond to what's going on. But if you protect Articles 39 and 40 of the Constitution, the freedom of expression and the right to unionize, and Article 40, the right to strike, are you interfering potentially with other principles? Does it make it harder for other people who don't have these protections to find work? Is there a correlation between having protections for one segment of the labor force and not protecting another segment? Can you protect work in all of its forms, or as we'll hear from Chiara, are there precarious workers who are really left out of this system? And to what extent does the law that protects some workers make a difficulty or create difficulties for others? And do all workers get a dignified wage, or only those workers who are covered by collective agreements? So you build strong security, but you introduce lower flexibility. And people who study industrial relations have struggled with the question, and that's why I put it here with a question mark. Does the strong security and the lower flexibility lead to something called labor market rigidity? in which it becomes important that insiders are protected, but you also create a group of outsiders and therefore have higher unemployment rates, less protection for people who lose their job, and more difficulty having them be reabsorbed into the labor market. This is a fundamental legal question that we can ask. It's also an industrial relations question, and it's a sociological question and a cultural question. Have we created those conditions? So I'm going to stop there, and then I'll introduce Michele after Lorenzo speaks.
Thanks, Tony. So I prepared just a synoptic table to make a comparison between the Canadian system and the Italian system of employment relations. So on the left side, for the Canadian, how it works, unionization is pretty well known to most of the people in this room. We must have a 50% plus one, the majority of employees in a community of working interest that decide to unionize. For example, in my university, there is a union for the professor, a union for the sessional, and a union for all admin assistants. In Italy, it's completely different. The unionization, so employees, they join unions based on individual choice. As they join an association, Les Amis du Montreal, or as they join any other association organization, they can join unions. So it's an individual choice. They can decide whether or not joining a union, and they can decide which union they want to join. Generally, it's a bi-confederation. So if here in Canada and North America, generally we have one union per workplace, per community of interest, as I mentioned before, one union for the professors, one union for the sessional, and only one union for the admin assistant. Generally in Italy, we have multiple unions within the same workplace. Generally, we speak about three unions, three confederations. Union organization in Canada is highly decentralized. The most important organization level is the workplace level. If we go and you ask to many people who are unionized or working in Canada right now, which one is your union? They say, my union at my workplace. Whereas in Italy, it's a model was an extension of the party organization. It's highly centralized. If you go and you ask to any employee who is unionized, to which union do you belong, they will just answer the confederation they belong to. Historically in Canada, unions have been organized by trade and then federations by sector. The general panorama is changing a bit recently, but that's the historical tradition. Whereas in Italy, confederation have been based on very important ideological cleavages. So we had the CGL, CGIL, who organized employees who were on communist and socialist stances. So they were close to the social and communist party. The CISL, CISL, was mostly on Christian democratic center, sometimes center-left, depending the stances on the political axe. And the will was mostly on center conservative. Generally speaking, was a political identity of the employee to belong to a specific union confederation. So when you speak about union density, Canada and Italy are not that different. Union density in Canada is 30%. So let's say more or less 1 out of a little bit less than 3 employees are covered, are in the union, are unionized, and in Italy 35%. In Italy, every single person, independently if he's an employee, is a retiree, is a housewife, is a person who is collecting stamps, he can join the union. Because it's a free association, everyone can join a union. What happens in Italy is that 35% of the employees are unionized, but then the number of members of the union more than double because all of the retirees who are part of the unions. Unions in Italy are very active in helping people who are close to retirement to fill out all the policies to join the right of retirement. And finally they say, okay, I'm happy, I'm going to retire, I'm going to join the union that helped me to achieve the retirement. For collective bargaining, since in Canada is a decentralized system, Union members are covered by a collective agreement, generally speaking, and non-members are non-covered, roughly speaking. In Italy it's different, since the collective bargaining happens at the national level for all sectors and by size of the firm. For example, let's say chemistry sector. We have chemistry big firm, medium firm, and small firms, and we have 3 different collective agreements. All the different unions representing the employees, they come together at the table, and all the different employer associations, they come together at the bargaining table. It's a national contract to cover many different tasks and all the employees in the sector in a specific firm size. So what happens is that in Italy, 80% of the employees are covered by collective agreement. So we have many people who are not union members, most of them were covered by collective agreement. The difference is in Canada, collective agreement is a kind of cage. So if the collective agreement establishes that I have to pay $20 an hour to Francesco and to Claude, I cannot pay Claude 20 if they do the same job. In Italy, it's a baseline. So if I want as an employer, I can pay Francesco 15 and I can pay Claude 2 million per hour. Speaking about strikes, there is another difference. Strikes here in Canada and in North America are allowed only during collective bargaining, only for issues relating to collective bargaining, and it's a collective choice. So the employees, they come together, they vote, do we go on strike or not. Whereas in Italy, strike, it's a fundamental individual right, as Tony mentioned before in the Constitution. For example, if you are all employees right now in a firm, I can strike. Maybe all the rest will continue to work. So it's an individual right that can be used at any moment for any reason. Most of the strikes in Italy oftentimes are political strikes against government policies, in the very recent especially. As we saw here, especially in Quebec, speaking about car dealers on the Lac Saint-Jean, rather than a BABI case, we have lockout that endure for 2-3 years. So the employers are putting all the employees out of my workplace, out of my firm. In Italy, are no longer used. Something that had been used at the beginning of the industrialization. Right now, there are no more lockouts. I let Tony present Tiziano Treu and
Lorenzo. So today we have 2 Italian guests who are going to speak at length about their own research and some of the issues related to labor laws and the practices of unions that affect precarious workers. First, Michele Faioli will speak about a paper that he has prepared together with Tiziano Treu. Tiziano Treu is a very important political figure. He's also a very renowned economist and jurist, but he's very well known in Italy for having established in 1997. So again, I want to get the timeline. We have 1948, then we have 1970, and now we bump ahead another quarter of a century to 1997, and a new labor market reform is introduced that takes the name Il Pacchetto Treu, the Treu package. And this package sets the tone for conversations about labor market reforms that last until 2018, when we see the introduction of a decree based on dignity from the populist 5-star movement in Italy. So you have these arcs of time, and this one is particularly important. The Pacchetto Treu, the Treu package, sets the tone for Italy's very first major labor market reform after the introduction of the workers' statute. And Tiziano Treu was the Minister of Labor and Social Security in the government, and it was a technical government. It was the Dini government in Italy at the time. And it was a group of experts. These were not all politicians by nature who were involved in trying to figure out how to keep Italy moving. And in that, Treu introduces the reforms. He later was elected in Dini's in the Italian Renewal Party, but he continued in the Prodi government and even in the D'Alema government. So he continued to be an important figure in the cabinets of 4 different prime ministers in Italy over his period. But in June of 1997, as the Minister of Labor, he proposed a law, first delegate, a decree, and then became a law, with his name, that the intent was to fight unemployment. So it was a law that was initially designed really about why does Italy have such high unemployment? Remember the things we said about the Constitution, it protects work in all its forms, everyone has a right, if the government sets a context. Well, it obviously wasn't doing that because unemployment in Italy was very high, and youth unemployment was high as well. So this law sets a fundamental tone, and writings about the Treu package have been almost a cottage industry in Italy that have been written about extensively, and Michele Faioli has been a first-hand protagonist, having worked very closely over the last 20 years with Tiziano Treu, so we're very privileged to have him here to speak about this paper that they prepared together. One last thing on Tiziano Treu, one of his books published at roughly that time, 1998, and then again in 2006, is on labor law and industrial relations in Italy, and it's the standard. It was set up as a standard in Italy. Michele himself is a well-renowned scholar, jurist, writer on issues related to labor market reforms in Italy. He's, in addition to working with Tiziano Treu, he has himself been a visiting scholar at Cornell University, a visiting professor and researcher and professor at Fordham University in New York. He holds he's an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the Catholic University, splitting his time between 2 very nice cities, Rome and Milan, but has to commute, but he does have a position in the business school at which means he has to teach in both cities. So Michele will today talk to us about this paper that he has jointly prepared with Tiziano Treu. So Michele. Change the slides?
Yes, they're not all.
I thought you said they were all in one. Sorry. We'll come back to those advertisements.
You can already think about some questions.
Which were the ones that he uploaded?
Maybe this.
No. Where?
Did you upload the slides?
No,
No, he hasn't.
I was busy. I sent you yesterday.
I thought they were all in one. Sorry. She left for a second.
Accesso un USB.
No, te l'ho mandata ieri via posta.
Here, bring it here.
No one's accustomed to legal scholars using
Yeah. Yeah.
But these are very good slides. You worked on it. It's a good thing we can edit this video. We could do that.
Yeah, yeah, we can see.
Okay, we'll have you come first. Because
Absolutely, no, I don't mind, yeah.
I was thinking you uploaded. I was thinking you uploaded. This was something. Okay, so I have to introduce Chiara first.
Right now, don't worry, I'll get it.
Okay. It's my major pleasure. You can. Così alla fine. It's my major pleasure to introduce Chiara Benassi, a very nice colleague and friend. She graduated in political science from University of Bologna, and then she did a master's degree at the University of Berlin, Freie University in Berlin. She completed a PhD in employment relations and organizational behavior at the London School of Economics, one of the most outstanding universities in the world. And then she continued with a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute. Now she's a senior lecturer, what means associate professor in North American terms, at the King's College in London, in the UK, maybe still Europe, we don't know. She has collaborated with many renowned people and researchers in the world. Maybe some of these names are well known to colleagues that I see, such as Virginia Dolgast, Rosemary Batt, Duccio Baccaro, Guglielmo Meardi. And she's now one member of the Italian industrial relations community abroad. To let you know, industrial relations is a very small field, we are a very small community, but is highly populated in Europe, and one in North America, by Italians. Someone would say maybe colonized by Italians, but we are present in many universities around Europe in industrial relations. She's now one of the leading experts on precarious employment and employment relations, especially comparing Italy, Germany, and other countries. I met Chiara 5 years ago. I had the major pleasure to meet her at the conference, and she was looking at her. Everyone was saying she's a rising star of employment relations. 5 years after, I can say that now she's still rising, and she's a reference for the field of employment relations. Please join me in thanking Chiara.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I never thought that anyone would talk so long about me. So absolutely undeserved. Anyways, so today I'm going to talk about, as Tony already mentioned, so I'm going to talk about union strategies towards precarious workers. I want to start with this some data. So this is how the flexibilization of labor markets looks like in Italy. The data starts in 2000, so this is OECD data. But surely, so if they started in 1997, you can see that at that point, non-standard work started rising. So this is involuntary part-time. Fiscal incentives were given for employing part-time workers, and also we have temporary employment as well. What the data don't account for is self-employment, which is very difficult to capture, but as Tony also mentioned, so there are a lot of self-employed contracts that can be freely used in Italy quite creatively as well. So the question here is, what is the role of the union in this? And this is very controversial. So the rhetoric is actually that unions have contributed to the segmentation of the labor market. As Lorenzo mentioned, so the union density is around 25, but 50% of the members are retirees. Unions are generally perceived as organizations which protect the insiders. Then Tony mentioned the workers on permanent contracts. Old workers may reason they are seen as not really representative. And I don't have the time to get into this debate today, but they have also been accused to have implicitly consented to the flexibilization of the labor market and to have entered political exchanges, political exchange process with the government, obtaining benefits for the insiders at the expenses of the poor precarious workers, which suffered from the liberalization. This rhetoric is being used a lot by leading political parties, the political leaders in Italy and newspaper recently. So we see up there, so Matteo Renzi, apparently he's always compared with Justin Trudeau, so I don't know whether you see similarities, but fine. So young, dynamic, so eager to reform the Italian labor market. This is the Fatto Quotidiano, so an important newspaper in Italy, and this is Luigi Di Maio, so the leader of the Five-Star Movement in Italy, saying that Italian unions need to be reformed, otherwise need to reform themselves, otherwise we'll do it as the government. So the idea here is that there is an anti-union discourse has been used by the government to marginalize unions politically. They have been pictured in the Italian debate as organizations which oppose any type of change, right? So, and funnily enough, the government has actually promoted some reforms, claiming that they are meant to break the monopoly of insiders, that finally the government was on the side of the poor precarious workers, and then they would eliminate the unions. So they did not involve the unions in the Jobs Act, for example, that is the reform of Matteo Renzi, which radically changed the Italian labor market because it changed the dismissal protection that Tony was talking about. It made it easier to hire and fire permanent workers, and therefore it was really controversial, while at the same time also offering some unemployment benefits for the first time, which could be accessed also by non-standard workers. Then we don't have a minimum wage in Italy, but actually the Five-Star Movement is quite eager to introduce the minimum wage, which is seen as an attack to unions, so because it's invading the competence of the union, so the autonomy of the union to set wages, and obviously it to some extent reduces the standards as well, because when you have like a minimum law, then employers are not compelled to use the collective agreements which set higher standards. And Di Maio also very often talks about this union reform. So what I want to say today is that I have a different opinion of what is going on in Italy, obviously. And I have to say that this presentation is not only based on my research, but it's based on the research of a lot of Italian scholars, not necessarily Italian, who have actually worked on the topic and have bothered doing field work with Italian unions and going in the workplaces to check what really was going on. My argument is that unions have actually contributed to containing inequalities, if at all. That they have done quite a lot about precarious work if you look at it in comparative perspective. And that the reasons for why they were relatively successful with it is actually the collective bargaining rights, which are now under attack with the reform of the unions and of the introduction of the minimum wage, and also thanks to their working class ideology, which is reinforced by their confederal structure. And I'm going to talk about the confederal structure and explain what that actually means. So first of all, I want to start with the Italian dualism. So this is what happened with the Jobs Act. So the Jobs Act is the reform of the dismissal protection, which was supposed to defend the outsiders, and in fact, so it made some unemployment benefits available. But at the same time, this is the employment protection, it reduced employment protection in Italy, so bringing it at the same level as in France and in Germany, that's here. But it also reduced the employment protection for temporary workers, bringing it lower to the OECD average, in fact. So there is, the of employment in Italy broadly so diminished since 2015. And this is particularly bad because in Italy, the labor market insecurity is much higher than in most OECD countries. This is an index which combines the risk to unemployment, the risk to be in unemployment for a long time, plus what you could actually, so the level of income support from the government in case you are unemployment. And Italy is up here, much higher than Canada, together with Turkey, Spain, and Greece, which are obviously affected by the crisis. What we also see is that income in so we see low labor market security in the sense that you are likely to get unemployed and you would not get much from the government to support your income. But you also see that in Italy, salaries are stagnating quite a bit. We were keeping up with Canada until beginning of 2000, and then suddenly we see a gap growing. So in Italy, actually, salaries are not growing, if at all. They are staying pretty much the same. Right? So the story here is that we see that labor has been losing ground. There is something that in which Italy is doing quite well, though, and this is low pay, the rate of low pay. So low pay is a relative measure. So this is calculated as 2/3 of the median wage. So this figure doesn't mean that Italian workers are paid a lot. In fact, we have just seen in the previous slides that they are not paid a lot. But wages are compressed, and wages are compressed towards the lower end. So Canada has a much higher wage dispersion rate. So on average, the salaries are higher, but those at the bottom are paid much less than those at the top. So we have very compressed wages in Italy. And why is this the case? This is actually correlated with collective bargaining coverage. This is actually what the unions are doing. So they are keeping wages compressed towards the bottom. This is Italy here. So this is collective bargaining coverage. This is the rate of low pay. And Italy is up there. So we have seen that collective bargaining coverage in Italy is around 80%. So the story that I think suggests here is that unions are struggling to redistribute income from capital to labor. So they are losing ground. It's a story about declining labor power. But when they do, they actually redistribute from the top to the bottom. So when they are able to collectively bargain. And I want to go into more detail in what unions do towards the bottom, looking in particular at precarious workers. Unions in Italy have actually started engaging with precarious workers already since the 90s. So pretty much at the same time of this Treu package. So the year after, each confederation set up a union only for atypical workers. And these unions are predominantly service unions. So they help workers, so atypical workers with a tax return. For example, if you're a self-employed, it can be really complicated in Italy. But also they provide legal services when individual workers bring their employer to court. They also organize a lot of campaigns to bring the issue of precarious work to public attention. So this is one. It's called Giovani non più disposti a tutto, so young people who are not open to everything anymore. And the other one is Desautels, and they both refer to the practice of misusing self-employed contracts as permanent employment. And they suggest that workers should stop and rebel and resist their employers, but also they bring the issue to the public eye. The union density of temporary workers in Italy is really low. It's around 10%, 10-15%. So not too bad, but not great either. But they bargain for agency workers, particularly, since 1998. In fact, this was part of the political exchange. So in order for unions to, so in 1997 when Tiziano Treu did the reforms, one condition was that unions would be able to regulate agency work. So they were given the opportunity to bargain. So they implemented, the law sets the equal pay principle, and this is implemented through collective agreements as well, which also regulate the working hours of agency workers and their leave. But also, quite interestingly, they provide, these collective agreements for agency worker provide some indemnity for agency workers in between assignments. So around 700 euros, I think. And the collective agreements also set up a bilateral training fund, which is managed by employers and unions. And in European comparison, in Italy, agency workers receive the most training, actually, thanks to this bilateral training fund. So my co-author from Oxford, Team Blandas, and I, so we coded the inclusiveness of unions towards agency workers in Europe. And we included union density, but also the provisions in the collective agreements. And quite surprisingly, despite the rhetoric in Italy, actually Italian unions do quite well. They are up there together with Swedish union, French unions, Danish union, and Belgian unions, which are all quite famous to have very generous collective agreements. And especially, obviously, like in the Scandinavian countries and Belgium, they also have very high union density, so they also include atypical workers. So what unions did then, as I just said, is to promote income support for agency workers. In that case, income support was linked to the fact that these workers were working. So it was a sort of unemployment benefits, which pretty much didn't exist in Italy before until very recently, and now we have a sort of a basic income. What unions started doing is that, so what union realized is that actually a lot of non-standard workers do not have access to any unemployment benefits. They are not covered by collective agreements. At the same time, so there is, in recent times after the crisis, there has been high unemployment, and unions, as I said at the beginning, are excluded from policy making. So what unions did is that they radicalized their demands to some extent. So before, so they were quite opposed to the idea of basic income because it was not linked to work. Unions were saying, we need to promote work. This is in our constitution. We cannot support income which is not related to work. They changed, in fact. And so the unions are now increasingly in favor of non-contributory forms of income to all workers, before the Five-Star Movement actually introduced it in 2018. And the three union confederations are the protagonists of the Alliance Against Poverty, which is a community-based organization which is constituted by grassroots movements, Catholic organization, and the unions, which has actually been campaigning for basic income in Italy in the last few years. What actually unions also do, so we have seen that unions have been sort of lobbying for basic income. They have been redistributing income to the lower end. They have set up unions for precarious workers. But what you also see, if you look at the sectoral agreements, in each sector, not for the standard workers particularly, but in each particular sectors, for example, the metal sector, you will see that there are provisions for non-standard workers. So the sectoral agreements in Italy set, for example, quotas for employers. So they can use up to 20% of temporary workers and agency workers on the workforce in that sector or in the company. Or they improve the conditions set by the law. So for example, the law says so temporary worker need to be hired after 36 consecutive months, and the metal agreement says, well, yeah, but actually the month doesn't have to be consecutive. So these are provisions that can be included in collective agreements if unions manage to. In the workplace, they are particularly active when it comes to transforming temporary contracts into permanent contracts. And they do it in a way which is quite interesting if you look at it from the insider-outsider perspective. So this comes from field work that I've done with Lisa Dorigatti, a friend and a colleague from the University of Milan, in manufacturing plants in Italy. And what the unions do is that they use their bargaining rights on working time for standard workers to get benefits, so to get the stabilization of non-standard workers. So the sectoral agreements, so this is a quote from one union representative. So they had bargained an agreement for stabilizing some agency workers in the company. So this agreement finds its roots into the company's necessity to ensure a more complete utilization of production facilities, also creating a new shift system. So the management needed to bargain with the union the new shift system because they need to bargain changes in working time by the collective agreement. So, and the company had a strong interest in that. And the trade unions were interested in regulating external work. So there was an exchange. So quite interestingly, they bargained concessions on working time on insiders in order to protect outsiders, so in order to stabilize temporary workers. So why do unions do that? Why are these Italian unions so relatively successful in doing what they are doing? So one is definitely that they don't have high union density, but they have high bargaining coverage. And this is because the employers have actually a higher union density, than Italian unions. So when employers are part of the employers association, then they apply the collective agreement. But the collective agreement is applied also beyond, because implicitly it is considered the minimum level. So if actually a worker went to court showing that they were paid below the collective agreement, they would probably win and get some money back from the employer. So, so this is one of the main reasons. So they can get there through their standards even when they are not represented in the workplace. But also, through collective bargaining, unions expand their influence. So as I said, so they can set more limits to employer discretion, so through quotas. Very often, so sectoral agreements also set the type of tasks that non-standard workers can be used to, so they expand their rights, but also they set this important exchange mechanism. Because sectoral agreements in Italy, for example, the metal sector, they say that employers have only a certain amount of overtime that unions need, that they can require. They can ask the workers to work without negotiating with the union. Above that level, they need to negotiate with the union. So this means that in the workplace, then the unions can use the obligation of employers to bargain over working time to stabilize temporary workers. Because they can say, okay, if you want us to work on Saturday, if you want to work us to work an extra shift, then you need to stabilize those non-standard workers. And it's an interesting counterfactual here, because in 2010, Fiat Chrysler, under the lead of a Canadian Italian, Sergio Marchionne, they withdrew from the sectoral collective agreements. So they were not forced anymore to negotiate over working time. Obviously, the company level agreements that they had a much higher amount of working time, overtime, that employers could require without asking the union. So since then, for unions, has become extremely difficult to stabilize agency workers because they cannot activate this exchange mechanism in the workplace. Okay, so unions are able to use collective bargaining rights even if not exactly on agency workers in order to get some benefits for outsiders. But why do they do it? And one reason, so the main reason is that they actually have a mandate Well, the main reason is that there are a lot of agency workers and non-standard workers, so at some point you need to take care of them, I suppose, and face reality. But there are, they have been particularly active at comparable high level of non-standard workers in a European comparison. And the reason for why they have been doing so is that they have a mandate to represent the whole workforce. So this is the principle of confederalism. So unions in Italy, they organize the workforce sectorally, so vertically across occupations and across levels. So, and this is how they can redistribute income from the top to the bottom. But also, sectoral unions are part of a confederation, and this means that they cannot bargain agreements which diverge too much from each other in order to avoid competition across collective agreements. This is very different from Germany, for example, where there is not this principle, and we see huge differences between the metal sector, very good collective agreements, and the service sector, very bad collective agreements. And non-standard workers are mainly in the service sector. This structure actually reinforces and reflects the working class ideology which was developed historically in the Italian Union, especially the CGIL. And this has been found to be one of the main drivers of Italian unions by myself, but also by other colleagues like Stefania Marino, who works on migrants and is in Manchester, and Nicola Durazzi, who worked on actually social policies, union support to social policies, and he's in Edinburgh. So, of course, like, this is a very rosy picture. There are pressure points. So, first of all, it's stopping the decline of union membership. So, if they are quite old, it's true. I mean, they have the right ideas, I think, but they are quite old. So, so they need to step up their game and try to engage more young workers, and this is extremely difficult given the low levels of trust and the political discourse. But this is necessarily to tackle this issue, which is actually quite important. So I've been talking only about agency workers and self-employed, but actually in Italy, as everywhere, so subcontracting is widely used. Subcontractors theoretically should be covered by collective agreements because it's theoretically dependent employment. But what happens is that when unions are not there, then employers get extremely creative when it comes to employment practices. So for example, you need to have a collective agreement and you're a supplier in the metal sector, but maybe you choose the collective agreements of the logistics or of another sector, which is a bit lower. You might also not put the workers in the right job classification and the right salary level. You might also employ self-employed even though they have they work as dependent employees, but you employ them as self-employed. So this is where, so the union presence in the workplace is really important because agreements do not only need to be bargained, but they also need to be enforced. And finally, they need to maintain a unitary labor front. They have been divided between 2002 until 2010, pretty much. Actually, 2012, they have been extremely divided on ideological grounds. One of the issues is actually flexibility. So this is where unions tend to split dramatically. They have been quite good recently because they were politically marginalized. I think it did them well to some extent. So it made them realize when you have a common enemy, then you sort of build a unitary front, and they managed to propose some political, to make some interesting political proposals together. But when they separated during 2000, so the government and the employers managed to bargain agreements with the more moderate unions, which obviously contained some concessions also in regard to non-standard workers. So you can really see when you compare the collective agreements, the difference in the provision when CGIL was in and when CGIL was not in. So this was to conclude. So to sum up what I wanted to say is that in Italy, the political discourse is extremely anti-union. So if you read the an Italian newspaper, you would rarely read something good about trade unions. And this is why I felt so strongly. Maybe you don't feel so strongly because you don't read Italian newspapers as much as I do. But this is why I wanted to talk about it today. And so despite the union discourse, actually unions have been quite engaged on the issue of precarious work in Italy. And they have been relatively successful. So of course there is much more to be done, and I see the dangers, but the idea is that I think they are on the right track. So, and I hope, and then we'll see what happens with the new coalition government, with the five-star movement and the center-left part. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara, for your presentation. Just when here is uploading. I mean, when I had a different jacket as a union bargainer, I did a lot of contract solidarity where we had the crisis. So core employees, they were working full time and they were kind of discharged completely the flexible workers. So what we did is say we work less, everyone worked less. So that was an arrangement that at workplace level we used a lot. Or bargaining even how many of the agency workers are going to be consolidated within the core workers. That was very, very common at the workplace level.
Okay, it's great to be back here, yeah, in some way. So, thank you very much for coming and for the invitation, above all to professors and colleagues, Lorenzo and Tony, and to Francesco for this involvement. I'm very happy to be here. Our time is limited. I will try to stay in 20 minutes, no more. And I'm going just to start. What I would pursue in this lecture is what I think is a potential clue of the Italian industrial labor relations. I will use my method. I'm a labor law scholar, so I will be a bit technical, but I will try to mix up with storytelling concerning Italy and the Italian labor relation. I'm not searching for a full-blown of connections. I cannot. We have no time. But our paper can give you a sort of selection of insights. And I will select on this selection some insights. My speech is divided in 3 sections. And the first section I will try to explain you the development of the Italian labor relation systems. In the second section, I will focus on one of the best points of the Jobs Act. In the third section, I will focus on the plurality of types, employment contracts types. So let's go on. The items of our paper are 4. You can see the first is regulation of new non-standard types of employment. The second is the relevance of the diversification of work for social security. The third is the regulation of workers' mobility. When we say mobility, this is a typical European word. Mobility means flexibility within the firm, at firm level, and within the labor market. The fourth section of our paper is related to industrial relations in the new digital economy. I will pick up, select some concept, and I will try to build up my speech on this. So, section first is Introduction to the Italian Labor Social Security Reform, or reforms. It is better. I try to sketch out the main Italian labor reforms using the name of Ministry of Labor. The first, the most important, is Treu reform of 1997. The second is Sacconi reform. Sacconi was the Minister of Labor of the second Berlusconi government. The last is Jobs Act, Mr. Renzi reform. But I also try to connect to these three big divisions also something that is well known but in some way is connected to. So Biagi reform is the first Berlusconi government, and Damiano was a Prodi government. They tried to develop some part of portions that the Treu law could not. Sacconi reform of 2011 is related to Mr. Draghi and Trichet letter of August 2011, when Italy was in a situation of a huge crisis, and we received some indication to reform our labor systems. Monti Fornero developed that suggestions. Poletti is the first minister of the before Renzi government, with Mr. Letta government. Jobs Act is the last reform, and this reform was in some way restricted by Decreto Dignità that belongs to the Lega e Movimento 5 Stelle government. I try also to select some items of this main reform. Treu reform is based on something that is, we can call regulation of labor market, maybe re-regulation, maybe deregulation. Why? Because we transformed our system that was a state-focused system concerning the matching between employees and employers in a mixed system where public office and the job center were in some way mixed with private job centers. So we had with the Pacchetto Treu the possibility to have temporary agency work, as Europe, as Germany, France carried out already in that period. We are in the middle 90s. Sacconi reforms that is based on Mr. Trichet Draghi letters, the presidents of the European Central Bank, was based on the idea that in order to reform the Italian labor system, we should move from a national bargaining system to a decentralized bargaining system, but with a strong primacy of firm level on the national level, with the idea that the derogation, the deviation of the firm level bargaining should be effective not only in relation to the NCBA, but also in relation to the law. So the firm level bargaining could deviate from labor law as and the same measure to the national collective bargaining. That was a milestone, bad or good, I'm neutral in this moment, a milestone in our system. My view is can I say asystematic, A is ablative, asystematic regime, but however we still have it. It is something that is new. The third is the labor market reform of Mr. Renzi, that is well known as Jobs Act, and we, in my view, we fully integrated the principle of flexicurity in our labor system. Why fully? Because we tried to combine whatever is linked to the flexibility in-out labor market with a strong and reformed unemployment system. We did not have it. We had our unemployment system that was defined at the end of the Second World War. So after 70 years, we were able to reform and to combine security with flexibility. And at the end of this process, we had also something that we call, in the Italian word is bad, but I should say first in Italian, later in English, is condizionalità. That means that in order to get an unemployment benefit, you should be trained and you have to accept proposals, offers of activation in the labor market by the job center, public or private. Condizionalità is something new and is strongly linked to Article 4 of the Italian Constitution. The right to work is the right to be trained and the right to be activated in the labor market. It's not a right to a position. Let's just sketch out of the social security reforms. We still have a reform of old age pension, seniority pensions, private and public. In 1995, with the Fornero in 2012, and again with the Lega 5 Stelle in 2018. The active labor market, I already stressed the point. In 2019, we reformed Reddito di Inclusione that was introduced by Governo Renzi in 2017 with a new measure that is called the Reddito di Cittadinanza. The main difference between the Reddito di Inclusione, that was a basic income for the most vulnerable persons in the Italian society, in relation to Reddito di Cittadinanza, is that Reddito di Cittadinanza is based on condizionalità. Reddito di Inclusione is not based on condizionalità. So you get the basic income behind the fact that you have an opportunity to work. Reddito di Cittadinanza is strongly based, and unfortunately it does not work, on the idea of condizionalità. Why it does not work? Because condizionalità does not work for, if I can say, not vulnerable persons, and as well, it does not work for the most vulnerable workers or persons in Italian society. There is a strong problem related to the organization of the job center. Let's see the session 2. Functional flexibility. I'm going to focus just on one point, variation of duties, of tasks. When we say tasks, duties, we say what worker performs. First of all, the problem. We had a statutory reform in 1970. Statuto dei Lavoratori fixed the principle that you could not change, variate the duties of a worker if that duty is not equivalent to the duty that he or she performed just before the variation. This concept of equivalence was based maybe on a corporativist idea that the position, the work, is a status. So if you, is a social status. If you are a postal worker, you cannot do something that is different from delivery letters because your status is postal workers. So you cannot change, and I, as employer, cannot variate your duty. So was a law so strong that we had something like 40 years of litigation in front of the labor judge. The national collective bargaining and CBA were strongly based on this idea. So they created a massive scheme that we call it job classification, a detailed job classification with position, duties, and this is very important, is a red flag point. Wage scale. So you have social status. You cannot change the social status, but linked to the social status by means of the job classification, you have also the wage and the right to that wage. So if you change the position, you change the wage. So you can easily understand why in 2015, on the basis of the German and the French experience, we introduced by means of Jobs Act this new rule that was aimed at make easier a job classification adaptation. And the technique, the legal technique, was based on this fact. Just eliminate the concept, the legal concept of equivalence, the so-called corporativist notion, and try to delegate to the CBA the function to adapt the job classification to the sector or the firm level. I don't know if I was clear on this point. So you eliminate the function to define by means of the equivalence concept, and so you avoid to put in the hands of the labor judge the power to decide if that position is more or less suitable for that organization. And you put in the hands of the unions and the employers' organization, or the employer, if you are at the firm level, the capacity to manage the job classification. Why we did that? Also because from Europe we had a strong input to, and money, to reskill people in order to make our workforce more suitable for the new tech digital revolution that we call in Europe Industry 4.0. There are billions of euro on this project. So you have to reskill in order to readapt, and so also to have an impact of job classification in order to create an internal flexibility. This is a very, if I can say, is a German approach to the labor market. So it's something like that. And in addition to that, we have something that is new. I worked a lot on this topic, and also my last book is on this topic, Robot in the Workplace and the regulation of workplace in relation to robots. Robots in intelligence, artificial intelligence, for us, for labor law scholar, are something in between subject and object of rights, because there is a one-to-one contact with workers. So the problem is how you can manage this new relation between workers and robots, intelligent robots. So you have to mix up everything that is related to duties and the work organization and so on. Unintended consequences. I call it that attitude of unions and employers. Why attitude? Because we have on one side the difficult relation between the national collective bargaining and the firm level collective bargaining. What I mean, we are seeing that this new regime, 2015, was frozen by unions and employers' organizations. Why? Because it's difficult to have an impact on the wage scale. Nobody wants to be liable to change a 1970 job classification that was designed in 1972, 74, when I was born. Nobody wants to do that. Above all unions, above all employers' organizations. Because it's a way to have an impact on wage scale. In some way, you have to move some equilibrium and so on. So it's difficult to do that. In addition, the firm level CBA that was delegated from the law at the same, with the same function of the national collective bargaining has some problem, because in case of deviation or derogation from the national collective bargaining, we have a problem of effectiveness. What we say, what I mean with effectiveness in Italian is effettività, efficacia. This means that when you bargain a firm level contract, the firm level contract could be challenged in front of a labor judge by dissenting union minorities and dissenting individuals. So if you deviate from the national protection, the best protection, and you eliminate some protection, dissenting minorities, unions, let's say COVAS, USB, or individuals, Michele Faioli, can challenge that regime in front of the judge and obtain the restatement in the previous position. So you can understand that employers are quite, suspicious of this. Why we have this? Because the Work Council that Tony explained, RSU, although they are granted with some powers, they have not the veto powers like the Betriebsrat in Germany. Because we are not a system, we have not a system that is based on majority rule and exclusivity. And there is no law fixing powers and fixing veto powers. So in the competition with the French industrial labor relations and the German industrial labor relation, the Italian labor relation has some criticalities that cannot be overpassed with a simple description of what we are or what we can be. We should do something by means of law. Let's go to the third section, labor market flexibility. Let's focus just on this point, labor costs, social contributions. We have a labor cost that is more or less 40 points on the wage, on top of the wage. So 1,000 is normal wage, if I can say just for example. 40 points are on top, and these are the labor cost. What we had as a consequence of this high labor cost, something that we call it in Italian, fuga dal contratto di lavoro subordinato. Get away, if I can say, get away from the individual employment contract. So we had some praxis of bogus self-employment in order to reduce and not pay Social Security. We had also a praxis of create several flexible types of contract, part-time and so on, in order to avoid or to reduce the labor cost. And we had several reforms. The intended consequences were at a certain point, Treu, Biaggi, for example, but also Movimento 5 Stelle last year in July, there was the idea that if you reshape individual employment contract, you can introduce a fair flexibility. But this is not true, at least in my view. Because we will see later. Another idea was we have to reduce labor cost, above all for some people, young people, women, and so on. And another consequence was we should train our workers, because that is the best key for the flexicurity, the idea that we should combine flexibility with security at EU and domestic labor market. What we have, this is the last slide, sorry, and I hope that was quite, I'm still in time. This is my map to explain the unintended consequences. We had, at the end of the day, an unfair flexibility that is based above all on the plurality of types of individual employment contracts. Let's see just two examples. The first, we still have a high youth unemployment rate, although we introduced in these last 30 years several types of individual employment contracts for young people. Apprendistato, lavoro part-time, lavoro a tempo determinato. But we still have 40% of youth unemployment rate. A huge number of this is related to NEET, young not in employment, not in education. Okay. And we have, above all in the south of Italy, this phenomenon, awful phenomenon, of irregular work. You say moonlight, you say also under the table. Yeah, we say in Europe irregular, undeclared. And this is, so maybe 40% is not true as a rate because you cannot measure what you cannot see. So this is fun. Another phenomenon is linked to gig workers. Gig workers are platform workers. Deliveroo, Uber, TaskRabbit. So what we did last year, Ministro Di Maio, that was a minister for labor, also for labor affairs, in August, was 14th of August. In Italy, it's a very important state, I can say, public holiday. And however, in mid-August, he created a table, something like a tripartite table with gig workers, unions, and platform companies, in order to create a new type of employment contract. After 1 year, we had something that is less data types, is a useless regime. It does not like to riders, it does not like to unions, it does not like, nobody likes this idea. But, this is just to stress that is an Italian attitude to create something of new to regulate. If you are something that is able to move, you should be under the law. But given that you are something that is able to move, you are also able to avoid the application of the law. Yeah, maybe Italian attitude. And just the last word. The last word is concerning social security. And this unfair flexibility was, there is something like, one-to-one relation between unfair flexibility and social security, because recently, in 2018, the government introduced what we call quota 100, that is a early old age pension, with the idea that the labor market is like a box. If you push out positions with an early old age pension regime, maybe, now they say not maybe, it's true, it will be safe, you will have the same number of young people in the labor market. But, as Banca d'Italia, Istat, CNEL, everybody say to the Italian legislator in 2018 that is a crazy idea. So they should not do that. They decide to do that. So we have now thousands of early old age pension enjoying at 60, 62 day pension and no decreasing of youth unemployment rate. But for the young people, and this is my last idea, we are creating basic income. So they could stay in their place, receive basic income, hoping to have some proposal and hoping to enter the labor market. Thank you very much for your attention.
First, thank Michele and Chiara for their discussion of the Italian situation. I tried to give you a basic idea of what it was in principle, in culture. We heard from Lorenzo how it compares to things we're more familiar with here in Canada. And then we have what would be a picture drawn for us about the nature of the legislative changes that tie things together. The labor market is tied together with a whole social security system, and all of those are part of the general principles. But what happens to people who have been left out? What happens to people who are not covered by the normal way in which Italy has tried to define work? If you're an atypical contract, if you're a precarious worker, if you're involuntarily in part-time work, what does that mean in terms of the exercise of your rights as a citizen? And what does it mean in terms of all of these attempts that Italy has undertaken to try to reform its constitution and its laws since 1948? It's a big question, and I really appreciate the way in which our two speakers have tried to bring together the general problem of the way the law has evolved with the specific problem of recognized institutions in the law, the trade unions, dealing with workers who were not supposed to have that kind of what Italians would probably call inquadramento, that kind of attachment to the labor force, that kind of positioning in the labor force. So it's a great opportunity now to take some questions from those of you who have an interest in any of the topics that we've discussed today, but specifically to Chiara and Michele for their consideration. Great.
Thank you very much, both of you. I was looking at the Gini coefficient while you were talking, and that leads to two questions, because one is quite stable. So inequality, and it's very close to Canada. There are a lot of countries that have stayed quite stable. And I guess my first question is to Chiara, and I'm wondering whether this stability, and you had the diagonal chart originally, I don't need it again, but showing how well Italian collective bargaining had stood up, and it was in terms of maintaining relative equality and compression, which Gini coefficient is an indicator of as well. I'm wondering if you look at a country like Canada, the Gini coefficient would be much higher if it was not for the state redistribution. So if you want to make an argument that the unions could have an impact, but they're actually making an impact as much on redistribution through the state as on the market, since it's about 32 here, or even 31 or 33, whatever it is, it would be 38 if it wasn't there. So it's not the market distribution through collective bargaining that's compressing it, it's state redistribution, and you can make an argument that unions are having an impact on that. So in the Italian case, I'm wondering, is the flat Gini coefficient an indicator of successful unions through market, successful unions through politics, the fact that the Italian numbers don't really actually pick up what's happening in the economy, or a middle income track where you saw that wages are low, so just the whole inequality question stays compressed as well because there's not as much growth to be redistributed. So those are a bunch of hypotheses. Apologies for making it too long. And on the judicial side, thinking about Spain, you have all of this constitutional aspect, and the Spanish judicial system has been a space of great creativity. And what I will say, you've got these post-fascist constitutions. So you make a very progressive constitution, and you endow a lot of rights in the constitution, which Tony presented very nicely. So then the question is, has the judiciary acted as a brake on and in favor of equality as opposed to facilitating inequality? In other words, is there a whole lot of jurisprudence, which is the Spanish case? Every time they try and introduce something, they say, no, it's unconstitutional. And Latin American countries all look to Spain as well in that sense and say, well, look what the Spanish say. So you've got a labor law which is out of sync as far as employers are concerned with what should be happening in the market.
Any other question? Is there any other question? Wait.
Well, I also had a question for Chiara Benassi about the broad macroeconomic impacts of unionization in the EU. So, but again, my question we're touching on similar topic. I guess more precisely, I was curious to know if you were taking into account technological automatization and the impact that this could have on the broad ratio between capital and wealth among workers. So you know, when we automate economic production, we're displacing wealth from income to capital, because we're not paying people anymore to do work, but we're investing in machinery, software, infrastructures. So I was wondering the extent to which you were taking that phenomenon into account.
Any other question? D'autres questions?
Oh, yeah. To what extent the European Union creates pressures on your national framework? And is there any general thought given to labor legislation as a driver of prosperity for the European Union?
I think we should
Yeah.
let Chiara go first.
Yeah, Chiara.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have. Or you
Yeah,
can
I'll just come here. Thanks for both questions. So I don't have like a super clear answer on that, but I have like one question is, does the Gini coefficient, is it based on wages, so on wages only, or does it also include wealth?
Generally, it's
income from
revenue
dependent
from
employment.
both, it's all income, including wealth and wages.
Okay, so I would,
So,
yeah.
you know, at the top of the Gini coefficient or wherever they are, you have the super wealthy.
Yeah, just
But
because
it's
I would
going in
expect
10%
to be different.
So
I would expect this to be different in Italy. So because Italy is a deeply unequal country, I think, when you consider wealth as well. And it has become more unequal over time. While if you look at dependent employment, this is where we see this compression. So definitely, like as actually Michele mentioned, so dependent employment is heavily taxed, and we have a progressive tax system, which is also in the constitution, and this is why the flat tax by Matteo Salvini could actually not work in Italy, because we have a progressive tax system. So obviously, like higher income are more taxed more. So definitely there is this combination. But this diagram, which I absolutely didn't do, there was Martin Kerner from IS in Amsterdam. But this, the diagram also showed that Denmark was quite high, and Denmark had relatively much lower taxation than Italy, and still there was a correlation between collective bargaining coverage and low pay rate. So I would say so that there is some independent effect of collective bargaining coverage, independent from state redistribution. And yeah, definitely. So in general, so wages are very low, and especially the skill premium in Italy is very low. So this also plays a role in that as well. Partly we could argue that this is also the collective agreements, but in practice, if employers, as Lorenzo mentioned earlier, if you want to pay highly skilled employees more, you can absolutely do it. So I think employers are also probably taking some advantage of these collective agreements, like paying the bare minimum. And regarding the automation, I love his question. So, so there are always like two camps or two fields. So there is obviously automation matters. Italy has a relatively high use of robotics, especially in the manufacturing sector, but not as high as Germany, which is actually has the highest rate. So I would argue that Germany probably would have a higher automation rate than in Italy. Actually, I know that this is absolutely the case, and still, so the salaries in Italy, so in Germany, so the wage share is, the labor share is much better than in Italy, despite higher degrees of automation. So I think there is quite good evidence in the international comparison that definitely automation matters as a general trend, but then institutions can really make the difference and mediate the effect of technological changes.
Thank you for these two questions. Labor judge, first. The Italian labor judge had an important function to split, to create a cleavage between the corporatist period, fascist period, and the new republican period. In 1943, we had a law that was enacted in order to eliminate everything that was a fascist or corporatist approach to labor-industrial relations. And the judges in the decades applied that law in order to have a collective bargaining agreement that are based not on the idea of corporations, but on the idea that there is a pact, a private pact between unions and employers. In addition, the labor judges created something that is a similar statutory minimum wage, because they applied Article 36 of the Italian Constitution and say that although there is no law fixing a statutory income wage, the wage is that related to the collective bargaining agreements, the national. But in some cases, given the situation, the social, the cultural situation, above all in the south, above all in the northeast, where the exploitation of workers was very high during the 50s, the 60s, the labor judges used some legal concept in order to create something like equality or same level field, you know, and so that was a sort of idea that given that the law was not enough, the judge should integrate. That is the point. However, their function is very important and still continue. what I expressed related to the variation of duty was a misuse of a legal concept. The second question, Europe and the pressure. I don't want to be or to some way to give the impression that I'm a bit heretical saying that. I don't believe that there is an Italian labor market. I believe that there is a European labor market. I'm not the only one to think that. So, when Europe suggests to France, Germany, Italy, Finland, Greece, Spain to improve the labor market is for the domestic level, but above all for the European labor market. And so since the middle 90s, we had indications, suggestions. Flexicurity is one of those. The European strategy for the employment are based on the idea that if you have financial measures that are harmonized at European level, you should have also tools that can improve the level of occupability at domestic level, at European level, in order to facilitate the mobility of workers at European level. In this viewpoint, we are going to introduce in Europe, in Italy, in France, a tool that maybe you do not know, but is going to be implemented in the next few weeks, that is called a European Social Scoreboard. It's an amazing measure. It's something that is based on the idea that we will have, since as of November 2019, an European authority for the labor market, Brussels located. It's not in Brussels, but it's Brussels located. And we have this authority that will be able to measure on a scoreboard with some indicators, labor economy indicators, labor law, industrial relation, training, vocational training, and so on, what at the domestic level is performed and why is performed in that way. So we are changing our, if I can say, mindset, because we are not saying any longer how I can improve, but why I'm not improving. So it's very interesting, this new approach, and in the next years we will see, in my view, a new social Europe, because we are having this kind. So Europe is so strong, and I'm very happy that it is so strong in relation to the domestic labor market.
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you, Michele. And please join me in thanking them. And thank you, Francesco, for making it possible to have this scholar friend to the Istituto Italiano di Cultura. Just final, we have another conference coming up November 14th, where we speak about still Italian employment relation from the point of view of especially Italian union, the relationship with parties and how it changes throughout time, and the relationship with the workers, as Chiara mentioned the first slides, how the reputation of unions changed in negative terms throughout time. We will have also a second presentation to see the impact of Italian employment relationship system on the global value chains. We are going to have Domenico Carrieri from La Sapienza di Roma and Lidia Greco from the Università di Bari. We have recorded the session. We will have some technician will help us to clean up a little bit. We will upload among the different webinars we have in the website of the Canadian Industrial Relations Association. I remember you that we are working all together toward the big conference that will happen next year in Toronto. We will organize the International Labor Employment Relations Association conference that is the branch of the ILO. Thank you very much for, yes?
And just for anyone who's interested, Chiara will give a seminar at Crint at the Université de Montréal at lunchtime, a lunchtime seminar this Friday. So,
thank you. Thank you.
Once in a week would be a bit too much. As much as you can be passionate about Italian.